Okay.
All right, we're rolling.
This is an interview with Aaron M. Bindman. Home interview, New Paltz, New York. It is the 6th of October, 2003. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. It's approximately 3 p.m. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Okay. My name is Aaron Bindman, and my date of birth is August 29th, 1916.
Okay. Where were you born, please?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
I completed 3 years at the University of Illinois as a sociology major before I went into the Army.
Okay.
And I left in June of 1941. I left the University of Illinois to enlist in the Air Force. But I was rejected on the grounds they said that my teeth were not in, I had a malocclusion, and they said my teeth would be a hindrance to balance, and so they rejected me. Then I went up to Chicago, and I stayed in Chicago until I was drafted in March of 1942.
Okay. I'm going to go back a second to, do you remember where you were and your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I was in Chicago at the time. I was a labor organizer at the time. I worked for the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union. And that's the way I heard about it, you know, over the radio and TV. And,
do you remember your reaction when you heard about this?
Like all other Americans, I was flabbergasted. I never thought that they would be bold as to attack the United States.
Now, you said you were a labor organizer. Yes. Was this while you were in college? You worked?
Well, actually,
prior to college.
While I was in college, I was very active politically. I felt that during the period prior to World War II, that we were not, that is, the Allied forces weren't sufficiently involved in stopping Hitler's Germany. That is what I called at that time, as a student agitator, we called that the phony war, where we were, Chamberlain made 4 trips to Germany trying to convince Hitler not to attack England or France, but rather to attack the Soviet Union at the time. And I thought that was wrong, and that would lead to a great disaster for the Allies. So that's basically what when I left thanks. When I left the University of Illinois in June of 1941, I went up to Chicago, and first I worked in several factories in Chicago. One factory I worked in was what was the name of that outfit? Plumbing outfit, and I worked in a foundry, and that was probably the worst job that I ever had in my life. I would come home at night black with soot, you know, and it was during the summer, and the heat in the plant was terrible. And later on, when I became a professor at the colleges, I would tell the students' parents, if they were concerned about their students, their sons and daughters not wanting to go to college, I would tell them, have them get a job in the foundry. And they would soon become very ardent students.
Okay, so you were drafted in March of '42.
Yes.
Where were you inducted?
In Chicago.
Chicago, okay.
Yeah.
And where did you go for your basic training?
The first, I went to Texas, Fort Bliss, Texas, which was a new sort of installation. Formerly, the whole area there was a cavalry organization. And this was a new Air Force base. And I was in the anti-aircraft artillery.
So this was your assignment then?
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of specialized training did you receive?
None whatsoever. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was in a basic unit, getting in a battalion, getting training in anti-aircraft artillery, and when my outfit finished their training and was prepared to go overseas, I was transferred to another unit of a similar type. And there again, I went through the same basic training, but by that time I became a supply sergeant. And I worked as a supply sergeant. And when that outfit got ready to go overseas, I again was transferred. Now the reason for the transfer was I was considered, because of my previous political work, I was considered a premature anti-fascist. That's the way I was labeled. And they had people watching me, and finally one officer, captain of my second organization, came to me one day and he said, "What the heck did you do in civilian life that we get all sorts of reports that we have to watch you?" And I told him I was a labor organizer, and it so happened that by the time I was drafted, I was first of all, I tried to enlist in the Army, but failed to get that. And that I was 100% dedicated to defeat of the Nazis. And but then after that, they began to transfer me to different places. They transferred me to first to Paris, Texas, to an Army hospital, and I was assigned to a psychiatric ward, and I became in charge of the orderlies in this psychiatric ward.
Now, did you receive any specialized training for that?
No training whatsoever. But, based upon the fact that I had 3 years of sociology and some psychology courses. And then I was there for, I think, about 6 months.
Now, what kind of patients were there in that hospital?
All these patients were psychotic.
Now, had they been in combat or?
Well, some of them have them, some haven't. For example, there was one guy there who seemed to me to be perfectly normal. And I went to the psychiatrist and I said, you know, what seems to be, why is this guy in here? And he said he tore up an army barracks and some years ago. He was in the army before, and he was re-enlisted, and they caught up that he was a psychotic, and then we had a number of people that were really off their rocker. And one of the most difficult jobs I had there was to convince the orderlies, who were usually soldiers who were either illiterate or had some kind of physical defect that wasn't sufficient to keep them out, but nevertheless they were relatively uneducated, and they would be tempted to beat the inmates because the inmates would be, you know, sometimes attack them or say a lot of very nasty things to them. And so I did, I think, a fairly good job in trying to see to it that the orderlies understood what psychiatric or what psychotic people are like, and that they should, you know, should not treat them badly. We used to, when a patient became excited and out of sorts, we would wrap them in sheets and dip them into ice water. That was we didn't have the drugs that we have at the present time to quiet them down, and this was very effective. Well, I was there for I'd say 6 months, and then I was transferred to Fort Meade, Maryland. And while I was there, I got a letter from what is his name now? A writer who said that a Congressman Vito Marcantonio, was going to meet with President Roosevelt to discuss the treatment that I was receiving and many other former trade union leaders in the Army, that we were looked upon as being enemy agents. And in answer to the letter, I wrote to Vito Marcantonio and said, since I am in Fort Meade, Maryland, so close to Washington, I would like to come to Washington to talk to you about it. And I wrote the letter on a Thursday evening and mailed it. Friday, I had my papers to Camp Ord, California. I was transferred, and I think about 3 months after that, I was sent overseas to New Guinea, Fort Moresby, Camp Port Moresby, New Guinea, into a replacement center. I was in that replacement center for 6 months.
Now, how did you get over there? Did you go in a convoy or a single ship, or?
It was probably a convoy. I don't know. I was on a single ship, and it took, I think it was about 15, 16 days. At that time, you know, they would make all sorts of turns and twists in order to avoid Japanese submarines. And at Port Moresby, New Guinea, there was nothing really to do there but wait, you know. And I volunteered to be a lifeguard at the officers' beach. And because there was very few officers who would be going swimming there, I began to tinkle with Australian coins. Australian quarters and half dollars were much softer in composition than our coins, which had more nickel in it. Mm-hmm. But so the Australian coins were very malleable. And I would beat out the rings, and then I began to flatten out the silver and cut different shapes. I would cut people's names to put on cigarette lighters. At that time, it were big cigarette lighters.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And a lot of the officers wanted me to make jewelry for their rings and lavaliers and things of that for their loved ones back home. And so I had a flourishing business over there of making, and that was the beginning of my interest in sculpting. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I was there for 6 months, and then I was transferred to an anti-aircraft glider troops somewhere in Nadzab was the place. And our mission was that we would be picked up in gliders by a C-47, mm-hmm. and then dropped off over a Army airport, and we would glide down, and we were supposed to, with 50 millimeter machine guns, to take the airport. I went on 2 flights with training flights, and it was interesting but a little difficult. One of our units, the pilot of the plane landed too hard and jolted everyone in the plane, and some guys were hurt thereby. But other than that, we had no contact at all with any Japanese troops. By that time, this was about, I would say about 1944, or somewhere in there, 1943 or 1944.
What was the airborne unit that you were assigned to?
The number of it?
Yeah.
I have some papers here.
Okay.
I
was just curious.
It was actually a new, innovative organization. Mm-hmm. But as I said, we didn't have any contact with any Japanese. The airport that we were near was in the interior of the island. And there we had some very interesting experiences. The native population of New Guinea were all moved to the center of the island, away from either coast, and we had contact where we were. We had contact with them, and we used to exchange fruits and attabrin. I was a medic at that time, Attabrin was a drug that the GIs would take every morning against malaria. And we would go to the local villages and exchange our Attabrin salt for fruits, bananas, and all kinds of exotic fruits that they had there at the time. When we got to these villages, these people never saw an automobile or a truck. And as soon as we would move into the compound, they would jump on the cars and the trucks, and they would want us to keep on rolling them around, you know. And a lot of people would run for their lives, you know. They had never seen an automobile before. And it was very interesting.
It must have been, for you, have been a student in sociology,
yeah, that's right.
To see a culture like this and the exchange between the two cultures.
I'm sorry that I didn't spend more time with them and try to gain more knowledge about their culture. We experienced several burials where they would dress the deceased person in full dress and sit him on a chair in the ground, because they believed that the deceased would continue to protect those who were left behind, that all their ancestors were in the area protecting them against harm, you know. From there, we moved up to Finchhaven, which was a little closer to the combat areas. But by that time, again, the Japanese had been moved away, and they had retreated from all those areas. And it wasn't until I got back to San Francisco in the hospital ship that I ever saw a Japanese soldier. They were war prisoners, and they were working on the docks of San Francisco. But prior to that time, we were totally moved along and sort of in the rear of any action that was taken. And so I really never saw any real military service. Now, when in the outfit that I was in both outfits, I moved with that outfit. I was the medic, and I would provide the soldiers with first aid treatment. If I detected someone with something more serious, I would send them to the hospital or the battalion unit in the area. And as an aside, since I was the medic, I used to receive supplies, and I would get about a gallon of alcohol each month. And we were instructed to take blue dye and put it in the alcohol so that no one would drink it. But I used to sort of take about a quart of it, and I would hold it off, and every month we would have a big blowout. We would mix it with what the guys called that is ascorbic acid, what they call battery acid, they would call it. We would mix it, we would have a real ball for a day. We also, you know, while we were over there, we also received a case of beer once a month. And again, all this was for recreation. Again, we didn't see any real action. And finally, after I was there for 18 months, and the rule at that time was after 18 months you were sent home. But there was no question I would not be sent home. But while I was there, I went to the commanding officer and I said that the guys would like to play basketball. And it was very difficult to play basketball on the ground there because if you would get any kind of abrasion, immediately you would be infected because the ground was so full of various germs, you know, and it was a very fertile area. So I convinced the commanding officer to build a basketball court. And they came, the Army brought in lumber and whatnot. They made a platform, a wooden platform, and real basketball court. And then each of the outfits in the area would send teams, and we had the competition between the teams, and it was a very interesting development, you know. It helped with the general boredom. Mm-hmm. Now, in that area of New Guinea, it would rain 6 months out of the year, and rain it would. And this was during the period when it was dry season. Mm-hmm. It was very hot there, but we used to play at night. They put up lights and everything. They really did the place up fine. And while I was playing basketball, one day I jumped up, and as I came down, I hit a rock that was on the wooden platform, mm-hmm. and I ruptured an intervertebral disc. Mm-hmm. And I didn't pay too much attention to that. And finally, as I went along and kept on working and playing and so on, it got worse and worse, and I began to get sciatic pains down the left side of my leg, and it became so I went to the hospital, and I was there for a couple of weeks. And during that period of time, they gave me massages, and I got better, you know. I said to the officer in charge, the doctor, is it all right for me to play ball? And he said, yeah. So I went back. As soon as I played ball again, I got another attack. And back to the hospital. And it so happened that Colonel Mayo, one of the Mayo brothers, was in charge of the whole hospital area, and he came through one day and said to the captain that was in charge, he said, this guy has a classical ruptured intervertebral disc, send him back home. And it so happened that it was just about 18 months that I was overseas. Mm-hmm. And all the guys that came to visit me, I said, they're sending me back home. And he said, how the hell did you do it? You know, just looking at me, I didn't look like I was sick like now. Mm-hmm. I don't look like I'm sick, but I can't walk. Mm-hmm. And that's part of, that's the, after years of from that injury. It became worse and worse and worse. And the other parts of my spine as well. I have spinal stenosis. Well, I went back on a hospital ship, and it was a very nice affair. You know, it was very pleasant going back on that. And when we arrived in San Francisco, as I said before, the first time we ever saw any Japanese soldiers, and they put us on a train, and in 3 days I was at the Halloran General Hospital in Queens, New York, Staten Island, New York. And the Halloran General Hospital, Louise!
Okay.
The Halloran General Hospital was devoted to neurosurgery. And they had guys come there with their skull shot off and their tremendous nerve injuries and so on. And I was there for 8 months. And about 6 months there, and again, I would ask the officer in charge, you know, medical officer in charge, whether or not I should play a ball or things of that sort. They always said, yeah, go ahead. And I would play and come down with an attack, and then lay up for about a month or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and I would go back to playing ball. Well, anyway, after I was there about 6 months, I was hurting very badly. The pain down my leg was excruciating. And so I grabbed the head surgeon outside on the grounds, and I said to him, either you do something for me or send me home. And he says, I'll tell you what you do. You come and see me Sunday at 9 o'clock. So I went there Sunday at 9 o'clock thinking I had a private chance to talk with the doctor. There was a line about 2 blocks long. And I got in back of the line, and the guys in front of me told me this is my 34th operation. They would have a severed nerve, and they would tie the nerve, and then by successive operations, they would straighten his arm out. It was a tremendous hospital, and guys would, and I felt sheepish about it. Finally, about an hour later, I got to see the doctor, and he scheduled an operation for 2 weeks from then. And in December of 1945, I was operated on an intervertebral disc in the L5, S1. And the immediate moment I got off that damn table, no more pain. I felt like a new man. And I was there for just a short while, and then they released me. And I went back to New York where my mother and my sisters lived. And I stayed with them for a while. And then I went back to Chicago to take up in the job I had before.
Now, did they give you any kind of rehab at all? Or?
Yeah, well, they outfitted me with a full-length leather metal brace. And it went all the way up to my chest, all the way down. And they don't do that anymore. You know, now, after the operation, they have you walk around the next day, you know. And they did a wonderful job. And no more pain, and I was very much relieved. But before that took place, We were at the Army Hospital, Halloran General Hospital. We would be required, if we wanted to get a pass to go out on weekends, we were required to do some kind of activity. If it was nothing more than sit in your bed and move your arms, you would get what they call a ruptured duck. It was a a pin, not a pin, but a stamp, which they put on your card, and if you got 21 of those, you would be given a pass to go out on weekends. At the same time, they had an organization called the 52 Club. These were rich men who took a group of soldiers out each week, and they would pick us up on Friday, take us out for a dinner in a restaurant, and then maybe to a basketball game at night, and the following day to a football game or to a play on Broadway, and all meals, and then they would take us back Sunday night. They would put us up in a motel, and it was really and I saw all sorts of plays on Broadway, saw football games, and we would, those of us who were ambulatory, would wheel in those who were on wheelchairs, and the lights in the stadium or the auditorium would go out, and big flashlights would flash as we walked into the place. It was really some experience, you know. Well, then as I said, I went back to Chicago and took up with my job as labor organizer with the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, which organized mainly warehouse workers. And I worked on that job for 11 years when I decided to quit and become a carpenter. And the reason I quit was because we were not making very much headway. I was very interested in getting the workers to see that they had to be very active in the union in order to make substantial gains and to be active politically, to get Congress to pass laws in their interest. But they were basically interested in getting another and I wasn't going to use my energy and time. It was very difficult work, you know, negotiating with employers, you know, it was very difficult.
Now, so, did you use the GI Bill at all for extra training or
no, not yet.
Or anything?
No,
not yet, huh? Okay.
Then I became a carpenter. One of the stewards in the union I was operating in, her father was an iron worker, and he was actually the foreman of iron workers. And I went to see him, and he said, "I got a job for you as a carpenter if you get a union card." So I said, "How do I get a union card?" He said, "You go to the union hall and you apply and pay your initiation fee, and then they'll give you an exam." So he thought I had some previous carpenter training. But the training I had was basically my own woodworking operations. So I went to the union, the International Brotherhood of Carpenters, and I paid my initiation fee, which was $175 at the time, which was a considerable sum of money. Yes. And then the two guys interviewed me and said, "Where did you get your training? Where'd you do your work?" I said, "I was in the Seabees," which I wasn't, I lied. And I said, We built bases all over the Pacific coast, and they asked me two questions. One, how high is a knob from the floor? And one was bridging in the ceiling. I don't know if you were between rafters. They have bridging in order to prevent the rafters from moving. I guessed that the doorknob was 36 inches off the floor, but I didn't know anything about the bridging. So I said to the guys, we were so busy and so in a hurry to build these bases that we didn't do any bridging. And they passed me, and I got a job in a tavern in Chicago, which had just burnt down, but was sufficiently able to be restored. And this iron worker put in a big, massive beam across the ceiling to hold up the whole building. And I began to work on that thing, and I worked there for 3.5 years. Wow. And in the process, got training on doing carpenter work. I did a lot of interesting things. They had a grocery store and a tavern. So in the grocery store, they wanted me to make it so that at the evening, that it would not appear as a grocery store, but would be part of the tavern. And so I devised all sorts of things, made accordion doors out of plywood, and made the hardware and what the heck not.
What are you printing?
As I said, I did that for 3.5 years, and I got a recurrence of my back injury, and I was laid up in the hospital for 6 weeks at a time. And the doctor said, you have to change your occupation. So I decided to go back to University of Illinois school.
Now, did you use the GI Bill then?
Well, I tried to get the GI Bill, but the time had run out.
Oh, okay.
You had 7 years
Oh, yeah.
in order to use it. I wrote to every congressman, every senator, but I was able, my wife worked, and I was able to get some help from the state. I got $20 a week.
I was just going to ask you, do use the 5220 club?
Yeah. And I went back to the University of Illinois, and the professors there were very anxious to have me, a returning veteran, and I did very well. I almost had A average throughout my studies. And when I finished my BA in 1 year, because I had 3 years prior, and I went to the chairman of the department and said, I have to have a wife and 2 children. I have to go to work.
Now, did you get married during the war or before?
I got married in 1947, shortly after I returned to Chicago. So the chairman of the department says, you know, you're not going to get a job worth anything unless you get a master's degree. So he said, why don't you stay for a master's degree? We'll give you some help. We'll give you a teaching assistantship and so on. So I said, okay, I'll stay. So in a year, I completed my master's degree. And the reason I was so successful was because my experience working for the union and my work in Chicago was such that I had the kind of experience that students don't have, which fitted in with my sociology training. So in a year I got my master's degree, and then the chairman called me in again, and he said to me, where are you going to go? I said, I'll get a job as a carpenter? And he said, don't do that. He said, I guarantee you, you'll go for a PhD, you'll make more money than you'll make as a carpenter. So I decided to stay on. I said, the requirements then were you had to get a competence in German and French. And I said to him, I'm not going to be able to. He said, you'll do it. And so I spent the next 3 years, summers and 3 years, and I got my PhD. And I took my first job in Canada, the University of Saskatchewan. And
I'm going to go backward a minute just to ask you a couple of questions. Do you remember, with you being politically attuned, find out your feelings, how did you feel when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
Oh, I cried.
Were you a New Dealer?
Oh, yeah. I thought that Roosevelt was the greatest thing that hit America, that he saved America from disaster. You know, all the programs, the labor legislation, the Wagner Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and then later on Medicare. And,
do you remember where you were when you heard about his death?
Oh yeah, I was overseas.
Okay.
I was. It was really a. You know, he was our father. We all had great confidence that he would do what is right. And also at that time, overseas, there was beginning the end of the European theater. And there were demonstrations both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific by GIs demanding to go home. And at that time, the idea was that the military would go to Japan and stay in Japan and so on. But the guys didn't want to do that. You know, they wanted to.
How did you feel, and where were you when you heard about the dropping the atomic bombs?
Well, I was at that time, I was didn't believe, really. Before that, a friend of mine had written to me and told me that they were building such a bomb. I didn't believe that that was really what happened, you know. But then later on, I learned, you know, that it was a devastating blow and ended the war in Japan. I wasn't too happy about the fact that so many innocent people were killed in the blast. You know, no, over 100,000 people in one fell swoop, and was very pleased after the war, the establishment of the UN. And the beginning of treaties limiting or stopping the building of atomic energy.
How do you think your time in the military service changed or affected your life?
Well, actually, it affected it in this way. I was in the information and education program. Everywhere I went, they had an information and education program where each organization would have discussions about the war and about the what was going on nationally, internationally. And I was always selected, because I had some previous college education, to lead discussions in information and education. And in the process got to know the thinking and feelings large numbers of soldiers, you know, which was very helpful when I became a sociologist. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting to note that the GIs were not that enthusiastic about the information that was being submitted at the time. They had a series of film, Why We Fight. Mm-hmm. And the film showed, first of all, they showed that the Soviet Union was a useful ally, and then they showed homecoming. And they showed a house, nice little one-family house with a white picket fence and a wife coming out and greeting her returning husband. And the guys didn't believe that. They felt that they would have a terrible struggle trying to make ends meet. Fortunately, after the war was over, the United States was the only industrial power in the world that was able to provide the necessary means of restoring England, and the economy of the United States took a tremendous boom, and in the process began to develop new methods of production, automation and cybernation, and this created good jobs. And with the when I came back, you know, by that time our organization was in the CIO. By that time, the CIO had grown considerably and was already a large force in American economy and thought. The CIO, which was established in 1935, by time I got back in February of 1942, of 1946, had grown to about 8 million members, which was a substantial force. And during that period of time, 35% of the workforce in the United States were organized. Mm-hmm. And we had large industrial unions and so on.
Did you ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
No.
Did you join veterans organizations at all?
Yeah, I joined the American Legion.
Mm-hmm. Have you stayed active in the American Legion?
No, I was never active in the American Legion. The American Legion was my agent in. I was given a 10% disability pension, and then some 3-4 years later, it was increased to 20%. And just recently, it was increased to 40%. And the American Legion was my agent in the process.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Thanks very much. Thanks for